I've never been much of a city guy. I spent most of my life working as an electrician in a small town, saving every penny to retire in peace. After my wife passed away, I decided to move into a secluded cabin we had bought years ago, deep in the heart of a dense forest. The idea was to spend my days far from the noise and rush of the world, tending to my garden and fishing at a nearby lake. For the first few months, everything was just as I imagined. Quiet, peaceful, almost therapeutic. But things started to change in a way I could never have expected. It all began so innocently that I didn't think much of it. I noticed some smaller tools, like a wrench and a hammer, missing from the workbench in my shed. At first, I thought I might have misplaced them or forgotten where I'd left them. Then it was the food. A bag of rice disappeared from the pantry in the shed, and even a can of beans went missing one day. I figured it was probably some kind of animal, maybe raccoons, so I started locking up the shed better and setting traps around the property, but nothing seemed to work. One day, I decided to buy a trail camera, the kind hunters use to monitor wildlife. I mounted it right at the entrance to the shed, curious to see what was causing the trouble. I left it there for 2 days and almost forgot about it until a Saturday night when I remembered to check the footage. Sitting in my recliner, I plugged the memory card into my laptop. The first night showed nothing but leaves rustling in the wind. But on the second night, I saw him. A man. Tall, wearing a makeshift mask and carrying a flashlight, calmly walking onto my property. He opened the shed door like he owned the place, took a toolbox, and walked off into the darkness without a care in the world. My heart was racing. I lived miles away from the nearest town. No one was supposed to be out there, let alone rummaging through my things. I stayed up all night, a rusty shotgun by my side, trying to figure out what to do. It wasn't just that someone was trespassing. It was the calm, deliberate way he did it that unsettled me the most. The next morning, I found footprints near the shed that hadn't been there before, but no clear trail leading to or from the property. It was as if he knew exactly how to come and go without leaving a trace. The next morning, I decided to tighten my security. I installed a new padlock on the shed door and hammered nails into the weaker spots around the windows. I also moved the trail camera to a different angle, this time pointing toward the cabin's front entrance, just in case he tried something bolder. I spent the whole day working on these improvements, and for a brief moment, I felt a bit more at ease. But as night fell, that sense of calm began to fade. Every sound outside seemed louder. The rustling leaves, the creak of the porch wood, everything made me jumpy. The following morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Right in the middle of my porch, someone had left a dirty, soil-stained leather glove with the fingers cut off. It was such an odd, specific thing that I stood there staring at it for a few minutes, frozen. I used a stick to pick it up and threw it far into the woods, but the message was clear. He knew I was trying to protect myself. During the day, I tried tracking footprints again, but just like before, there were no clear trails. It was as if he simply appeared and disappeared at will. I decided I couldn't ignore the seriousness of this anymore. I called the only neighbor I had in the area, a farmer named Bill, who lived about 6 miles away. He listened patiently and suggested I call the police. But how could I explain this without sounding crazy? Besides, the local sheriff rarely came out this far unless it was to break up fights in town. Bill offered to lend me his dog, a big old German shepherd named Duke, to help keep watch. That night was the first in a long time that I felt a little less exposed, knowing Duke was there with me. But my newfound sense of safety didn't last long. 2 days later, I woke up to Duke growling near the front door. The sound was low, but it carried a warning. I grabbed my shotgun and crept to the living room window, trying to see anything in the darkness. That's when I spotted it. A light flashing between the trees, like someone was toying with a flashlight. I stood there, frozen, as the light suddenly went out. Before I could react, a sharp thud echoed on the porch. When I cautiously opened the door, another gift was waiting for me. A small wooden doll with a grotesquely carved face, stained with what looked like red paint or blood. That doll was enough for me to realize I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. This wasn't just theft or trespassing anymore. It was a psychological game, and I was losing. I spent the next day walking around the property with Duke, trying to find any clues about where this guy might be coming from. But the forest surrounding my cabin was dense, with ancient trees and tall underbrush that turned it into a maze. Every time I thought I'd found a trail, it would disappear before I could follow it far. It was as if the intruder knew every inch of the area better than I did. That night, I decided to stay awake and wait. I set up a chair by the living room window, with Duke lying at my feet and my shotgun loaded and ready. The clock seemed to crawl as I tried to keep my eyes open, fighting off sleep. Around midnight, I heard a sound that put me on high alert. Footsteps. These weren't the light steps of an animal, but deliberate human footsteps, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I grabbed the shotgun and flashlight and moved closer to the window, peering into the darkness. Then I saw him. He was there, standing at the edge of the forest, his flashlight off, just watching my cabin. For a moment, I froze. He was only a few yards from the house, and even in the dim light, I could see he was wearing that same crude mask. Something about the way he stood there, motionless, sent a chill through me, like a predator studying its prey. I decided I wasn't going to wait to see what he'd do next. I burst through the door, shouting for him to get off my property, the shotgun aimed straight at him. As soon as my voice broke the silence, he turned on his heel and disappeared into the trees. I ran to the edge of the forest with Duke by my side, but he was already gone. Once again, it was as if he had vanished into thin air. The next day, I knew I couldn't stay here alone any longer. I called Bill and asked him to come over to help me reinforce the property even further. Together, we set up traps around the house and installed a heavy-duty lock on the front door. But even with the new precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. I didn't know who this man was, why he was doing this, or how he was able to act so confidently without fear of being caught. That afternoon, as we were finishing up, I noticed something carved into the wooden planks of the porch that hadn't been there before. 3 simple words, etched with precision. "You can't leave." The message carved into the porch left me more paranoid than ever. Who was he? What did he want from me? And more importantly, how was he managing to get so close despite all the precautions? I couldn't stop thinking about those words. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself with small tasks, but the tension in the air was unbearable. That night, I decided I wasn't going to let him control me anymore. I left all the lights on in the house, kept the shotgun by my bed, and tried to get some rest with Duke curled up nearby. But the unease wouldn't let me sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a loud, metallic crash, like something heavy had been knocked over. Duke started barking furiously. I grabbed the shotgun and rushed to the living room, expecting to catch the intruder in the act. But when I opened the door, everything was silent again, as if the noise had never happened. Still, a creeping feeling washed over me, like I was being watched. Duke was still growling, his fur bristling as he stared toward the tree line. I followed his gaze but saw nothing. The silence around the cabin was suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. At dawn, I discovered what had happened. The trail camera I had set up by the cabin's entrance was gone. He had taken it, leaving behind no tracks, no clues. My mind raced with questions. Was he trying to intimidate me? Was this all just a sick game? That morning, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here any longer. I called Bill and asked him to drive me to the nearest police station. This time, I wasn't going to hold anything back, even if it sounded insane. At the station, the officer who took my report seemed skeptical, but promised to send someone to check the property. When I returned home with Bill and Duke, we found the trail camera on the porch, smashed into pieces. It was his final message. I knew then that this wouldn't stop until I left. That same week, I put the cabin up for sale and moved to town. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he wanted. But one thing is clear. He wasn't just trespassing on my property. He was invading my mind. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to hear footsteps on the porch, even though I'm far away from that forest. At the time, I was in my last semester of college, completely burned out. It was December, finals week, and my parents had gone out of town to visit my grandmother, leaving the house entirely to me. I thought it would be nice to stay away from the crowded campus and study in peace. Our house is in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors greet you but don't meddle too much in your life. That specific night, I had spent the whole day buried in books, only to realize I had nothing to eat. It was almost midnight, but the idea of frozen pizza seemed better than studying hungry. I grabbed my car keys and headed to the 24-hour grocery store, thinking it'd be a quick trip. The street was nearly empty when I returned, which wasn't surprising for a Tuesday night at that hour. As I parked in the driveway, I noticed someone standing across the street in front of the neighbor's house. It was a thin man wearing a dark jacket and a low baseball cap that hid most of his face. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at one of the ground floor windows. My first instinct was to ignore him. This kind of thing isn't exactly uncommon in quiet neighborhoods. Sometimes people are just waiting for someone or lost in thought. But something about how still he was, almost frozen in time, unsettled me. I tried to shake the feeling off and went inside. Once I locked the door, I felt a bit safer. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the central heater. I went straight to my room with the groceries, thinking about heating up the pizza and forcing myself to study for a few more hours. But I couldn't stop thinking about the man outside. Was he still there? Summoning some courage, I peeked out of my bedroom window, which had a direct view of the street. He was gone. I let out a sigh of relief and went back to my routine, convincing myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just waiting for an Uber. Around 3 a.m, I was jolted awake by a loud knocking at the door. It wasn't casual, it was persistent, almost frantic. For a moment I froze, still groggy from sleep, trying to figure out if it was real or part of a dream. The knocking continued, and my heart started racing. I got up slowly, trying not to make any noise, and crept into the hallway. The sound was coming from the front door. I looked through the peephole, and to my horror, it was the same man from earlier. He was on the porch, swaying back and forth like he was nervous or impatient. By now, I was wide awake, and a cold chill ran down my spine. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. He kept knocking, not saying a word, just that relentless, irritating sound, like he was trying to break the silence of the night. I glanced through the peephole again and noticed he was holding something, a long object I couldn't immediately identify. At this point, my mind was racing with all kinds of possibilities. Why was he here? What did he want? Was it just a coincidence, or had he seen me come home earlier and figured out I was alone? I remembered my phone charging on the bedside table and quietly ran to grab it. I tried to stay as silent as possible as I dialed 911. My voice was low and shaky as I explained the situation, but the dispatcher was direct. "Stay inside. Keep the doors locked. Officers are on their way." The sense of relief was fleeting, because just then, the knocking stopped. I peeked through the peephole again and saw that he was no longer on the porch. The street outside seemed empty. That was worse. Not knowing where he was felt more terrifying than seeing him right there. I decided to check every door and window in the house, even though I was certain they were locked. It was almost a way to calm myself. When I reached the kitchen, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The curtain on the side window was slightly open, just enough for someone to peek inside. I was positive it had been fully closed before I went to bed. I turned off the kitchen lights, trying to make myself less visible, and retreated to the hallway. my breathing now heavy and erratic. The police needed to get here soon. Then I heard footsteps, not in front of the house, but in the backyard. They were light, cautious, like someone trying to avoid making noise, but the crunch of gravel beneath their feet gave them away. I didn't have the courage to look out the window, so I stayed frozen in the hallway, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline. The sound grew louder until it stopped directly beneath the living room window. The silence was deafening for a few seconds, and then I heard the unmistakable creak of a doorknob being tested. My entire body was on high alert, as if every cell was screaming at me to do something. I knew all the doors were locked, but the sound of the doorknob being tested echoed in my head like a warning. He was trying the front door calmly, as though he had all the time in the world. Each attempt made the silence feel heavier. I stayed frozen in the hallway, trying to convince myself that as long as the locks held, I'd be safe. But what if he found another way in? What if I had forgotten to lock a window? That thought started to eat away at me. Finally, the sound stopped. For a few seconds there was nothing, and then I heard something being dragged across the ground, a harsh scraping noise, like metal on stone. I couldn't help myself and peeked through the living room curtain. There he was, in the backyard, holding a crowbar. He was moving slowly, almost methodically, scanning the windows as if he was looking for an easy entry point. My heart nearly stopped when he turned and looked directly at the window I was peeking from. I don't know if he actually saw me or just sensed he was being watched, but that moment was utterly terrifying. I ran back to the hallway and crouched behind the stairs, feeling more vulnerable than ever. I called 911 again, almost pleading for the officers to hurry. This time, the dispatcher assured me that the patrol car was close, but I needed to stay calm and avoid doing anything that might draw the intruder's attention. Then the footsteps returned, this time moving away from the backyard. I thought he might be leaving, but seconds later, I heard a loud crash from the side of the house, the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. He was trying to get in. My thoughts were a chaotic mess. I knew I had to do something, but what? I grabbed one of the kitchen knives, trying to convince myself that it was better to be prepared if he managed to break in. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold onto the handle. Meanwhile, the noises continued, the sound of glass being pushed aside and the creak of old wood as the window frame was forced. Then, finally, I saw the flash of red and blue lights reflecting on the walls of the house. The police had arrived. The flashing lights outside brought a mix of relief and fear. Relief because the police were finally here, but fear because I had no idea how the man would react now that he was cornered. I stayed crouched behind the stairs, listening to the heavy footsteps of the officers in the yard. Their voices cut through the quiet night, firm and commanding. "Come out where we can see you! Hands up!" For a moment, there was silence, and I wondered if he had already run off. But then, I heard a scream. Not an ordinary scream, but something raw, primal, filled with rage and desperation. I risked getting up and looked through the living room window. 2 officers were wrestling the man to the ground, and he was still gripping the crowbar, thrashing wildly. He looked like a trapped animal, completely out of control. Another officer was shining a flashlight on the side of the house where the broken window was. The scene was surreal, like something out of a movie. I felt like a spectator, helplessly watching from the supposed safety of my home. But at the same time, I knew that if they hadn't arrived when they did, he would have been inside, and I wouldn't be safe at all. After a few intense minutes, the officers managed to subdue him and cuff his hands behind his back. He was still muttering incoherently as they dragged him toward the patrol car. Slowly, I stepped outside, still clutching the knife, which I placed on the ground when one of the officers approached me. He was tall, with a tired expression, and asked if I was okay. I explained everything, how I had seen the man earlier, the knocking, the sounds of him trying to break in. While I was talking, another officer, younger and more energetic, went inside to check if there was any additional damage or anything left behind. It wasn't until things calmed down that they told me the man had already broken into several homes in the neighborhood that night. He had forced his way into at least 3 houses before coming to mine. They found evidence suggesting that he thought my house was empty too, like the others. The crowbar was his tool for prying open doors and windows. Hearing that made my legs feel like jelly. It was terrifying to think about how close I had come to a much worse situation if I hadn't called the police when I did. The next morning, my parents came home early after I told them what had happened. Even now, when I share this story, I feel the same chill I felt that night. I've never been able to sleep peacefully in that house since. I still lock all the doors and windows like I always did, but I also locked something inside myself. That unsettling realization that sometimes the real horror isn't what you imagine, but what's waiting outside in the dark. My wife, Emily, and I had recently moved into our new home, one of those small, cozy houses in a quiet residential neighborhood. It was a dream come true after getting married 2 months ago. Life was peaceful and simple, just the way we liked it. During the day, the neighborhood was lively with kids playing on the sidewalks and neighbors tending their gardens. But at night, the silence was absolute. That day, we had gone to bed early, exhausted from yet another round of renovations. Little did we know that the night was about to turn into our worst nightmare. Around 3 a.m., the sharp sound of the doorbell shattered the silence. I woke up with a start, still groggy and confused. Emily, startled, grabbed my arm and whispered, "Who could it be at this hour?" Her voice trembled slightly. I got up cautiously, trying not to make any noise, and made my way to the door, my heart pounding. When I looked through the peephole, I saw a woman outside. She looked disheveled. Her hair was messy, her clothes were torn and dirty, and her face was pale as if she hadn't slept in days. "Please, help me. My car broke down and I don't know what to do," she pleaded, her voice weak and almost desperate. My first instinct was to be on guard. Something about the situation felt off, but at the same time, it was hard to ignore someone asking for help. I spoke softly to Emily, explaining that it was a woman seemingly lost and in distress. "We can't just open the door," she whispered back, clearly uneasy. I agreed and decided the best thing to do was to call roadside assistance for her. When I returned to the door and explained our decision, the woman, who had seemed calm before, suddenly snapped. Her soft voice turned into frantic screams. She began pounding on the door with her fists and kicking it with alarming strength. "You don't understand, he's coming for you," she screamed, her voice a mix of desperation and rage. My heart was racing. Emily was crying now, clutching her phone with trembling hands, ready to call the police. Outside, the woman's screams echoed like something out of a nightmare. I peeked through the peephole again, and she no longer looked human. Her eyes were wide, the pupils so dilated they almost covered her irises, and her mouth twisted into a horrifying grin between her shouts. Suddenly, she stopped screaming and stood completely still, staring at the door as if she could see straight through it. The silence that followed was even worse than the screaming. I stood frozen, still looking through the peephole. The woman didn't move, but her eyes were locked on the door, and it felt like somehow she knew exactly where I was. Then, as if triggered by some invisible signal, she began murmuring something fast and incomprehensible, almost like she was praying. The words came out in a low tone, but too quickly to make any sense. I backed away from the door, a chill running down my spine. Emily, still holding her phone, managed to whisper with a shaky voice, "What if she's not alone?" That thought hit me like a punch in the gut. I moved to the living room window, careful not to be seen, and peeked out through the curtains. The street outside was empty, illuminated only by the dim glow of the streetlights. There was no sign of a broken-down car, and the emptiness around us seemed to swallow any sense of normality. I returned to Emily and told her to call the police. She dialed, trembling, but before she could complete the call, the woman outside started screaming again. "You can't escape! He's here!" Her voice was so loud it felt like it would shatter our eardrums. Suddenly we heard a sound, but it wasn't coming from the front door. It came from the back of the house, a scraping noise, like long nails dragging against the outer walls. Emily dropped the phone and looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. I didn't want to believe it, but it seemed like there was more than one person out there. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find while Emily clutched the phone like it was a shield. The feeling of being surrounded was unbearable. But what scared me even more was the growing sense that this wasn't just a group of vandals or burglars. There was something unnatural about it all. Then the lights in the house flickered and went out completely, plunging everything into oppressive darkness. Emily let out a scream that sliced through the air, and I pulled her close, trying to keep her calm. Outside, the silence reigned again, but the sensation of being watched grew stronger by the second. I grabbed a flashlight we kept in the kitchen drawer and shone it down the hallway. When the weak beam reached the front door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the woman anymore. A larger, taller shadow stood behind her, as if it had materialized from the darkness. They both stood still, but the sense of threat was overwhelming. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we were dealing with. The shadow behind the woman seemed to writhe slightly, as if it were alive, pulsing in ways that defied logic. I couldn't make out a face or details. It was just a massive, shapeless figure made of pure darkness. Emily clung to my arm so tightly that my circulation was nearly cut off, and I knew she was at her breaking point. "Let's lock ourselves in the bedroom," she whispered, barely audible. The idea made sense, but the problem was getting there without drawing attention. As we debated our next move, the sounds returned, much closer this time. Scratching and banging came from different parts of the house, as if multiple hands were testing the walls for weak spots. It felt like a siege. My flashlight shook in my hand, but I decided to move. I pulled Emily with me, and we began creeping down the hallway toward the bedroom. Every step felt heavier, as if the air around us was charged with something malevolent. When we finally shut the door and locked it, the woman outside began laughing. It wasn't a human laugh. It was rough, irregular, almost animalistic. Inside the bedroom, I tried to think of a plan. I called the police, but the call wouldn't go through. Just a strange noise like static filled the line. Despair started to take hold. Emily sat on the floor, hugging her knees and murmuring a prayer, something I had never seen her do before. Then, suddenly, the laughter stopped, and everything went silent again. The kind of silence that makes your ears hurt. My breathing felt too loud, and I tried to control it, but I couldn't stop shaking. That's when the doorknob to the bedroom started to turn slowly, as if someone on the other side was trying to open it. I raised the knife, the flashlight pointed at the door. "Get out of here! I called the cops! They're on their way!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The doorknob stopped turning, but then came a loud bang, followed by another and another. The hinges trembled with each impact, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. That's when a new sound emerged, a distant howl, deep and resonant, vibrating through the entire house. Emily looked at me with tears streaming down her face, and I knew she had heard it too. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the hallway, right on the other side of the door. The howl grew louder, spreading through the house as if the walls themselves were amplifying it. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. And then, without warning, it stopped. The silence that followed was so abrupt, it left me disoriented. I waited a few seconds, not daring to move, but nothing happened. The hallway was quiet, and the doorknob didn't turn again. Emily whispered, "Do you think they're gone?" I didn't know how to answer, but I knew I had to check. Against all logic, I grabbed the flashlight and stepped toward the door. I opened it slowly, knife in hand, expecting the worst. But the hallway was empty. There were no signs of a break-in, no trace of the woman or the shadow. Just the oppressive silence and the faint smell of something burnt lingering in the air. I signaled for Emily to follow me, and we cautiously made our way to the living room. That's when I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. My stomach sank. I was certain I had locked it. Emily shook her head, tears still streaming, as if willing herself to forget everything. I crept toward the door, expecting to see something outside, but the street was completely deserted. However, there was something on the doorstep. A dark mark, almost like ash, formed a perfect circle on the threshold. In the center of it lay a small object, twisted and metallic, like a crude symbol. I picked it up with a cloth, careful not to touch it directly, and felt an icy chill spread through my hand. Emily begged me to drop it, but I needed to understand. I placed it on the table to examine it further, but before I could, we heard something again. Footsteps outside, heavy and uneven, like something with crooked legs walking down the sidewalk. We didn't sleep that night. We called the police, but they found nothing except the marks on the door. There were no signs of forced entry, and no one in the neighborhood reported seeing or hearing anything. We kept the symbol, but one day it vanished without explanation. Since then, nothing else has happened, but Emily and I decided to move a few weeks later. We never understood what happened that night, and maybe it's better that way. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still wake up thinking I heard the doorbell. I never thought an ordinary night could turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. It happened about 2 years ago when I was in college, sharing an apartment with my roommate, Josh. He was a laid-back guy, the kind who always stuck to a set routine. That week, he was visiting his family, and I had volunteered to house sit. Nothing too complicated, you know? Water the plants, feed the cat, basic stuff. What I didn't know was that this would turn into the longest week of my life. It was a Tuesday, and I had been out all day, between classes and my shift at work. All I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and relax. When I parked in front of the apartment, I noticed the kitchen light was on, which struck me as odd because I was sure I'd turned it off before leaving. But honestly, I was so tired that I didn't pay much attention. I'd forgotten little things like that before, leaving a light on or a faucet dripping. I just wanted to go inside, grab something to eat, and collapse into bed. When I walked in, though, something made me uneasy. The back door was slightly ajar, just a tiny crack. My first thought was, oh, it must have been the wind. But as I closed the door and locked it, a chill ran up my spine. It wasn't exactly fear, more like a sense that something was off. I took a quick look around the kitchen, which seemed fine, and then checked the rest of the house. Nothing appeared out of place. The cat, Frankie, was curled up on the couch, giving me that uninterested look cats always have. I decided to shrug it off and go about my night. After a quick shower, I got into bed with my phone, trying to unwind. The silence in the house was almost comforting, but at the same time, it felt heavy, if that makes sense. Even so, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I figured the emptiness of the place was playing tricks on me. With Frankie purring at the foot of the bed, I started drifting off. That's when I heard it. A faint noise coming from the living room. It wasn't loud, just something subtle, like the creak of wood or a soft movement. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again. This time it was clear. Someone or something was out there. My heart started racing, but I tried to stay calm. It's probably Frankie, I thought. But something didn't feel right. The cat rarely left the bedroom at night, especially when he was cozied up under the blanket with me. I got up quietly, trying not to make a sound, and walked to the bedroom door. I opened it just a crack to peek down the hallway. Everything looked normal. The silence was almost absolute, except for the sound of the wind outside. I crept toward the living room, feeling the cold floor beneath my feet. Frankie was still on the couch, staring intently at the kitchen door with his ears perked up, as if he had seen something. When I reached the living room, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Josh's rocking chair, which was always pushed against the wall, was slightly tilted forward, like someone had just gotten up from it in a hurry. I was certain it hadn't been like that earlier. I glanced around again, searching for some logical explanation, but nothing seemed out of place. I convinced myself that maybe I had accidentally left the chair like that in the morning and simply didn't notice. Still, the unease was growing in the back of my mind. I went back to the bedroom, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay in bed for a while, scrolling on my phone to distract myself, but the discomfort lingered. Then I noticed another detail that made my blood run cold. On the dresser next to the bed, where Josh always kept a framed photo of his family, there was a smudge, a faint fingerprint on the dusty surface. I hadn't touched it, and I couldn't think of anyone else who could have. The air in the room felt heavier, almost suffocating, like the house itself was trying to warn me that something was off. Suddenly, another sound broke the silence. This time, it was more distinct. A noise coming from the hallway, as though someone had bumped into something. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me sit up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it toward the bedroom door. The light shook in my trembling hand as I tried to decide what to do. Running seemed like the best option, but what if it was just my imagination? Still, I knew I couldn't ignore it. Taking a deep breath, I decided to check again. I got out of bed, trying not to make a sound. Every step seemed louder than usual, as if the wooden floor was deliberately betraying me. The flashlight on my phone wobbled as I slowly opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, oppressive, as though I wasn't truly alone. My first instinct was to head straight for the front door and get out of the house, but curiosity, or maybe the fear of turning my back on the unknown, pushed me toward the living room. It wasn't just the noise that bothered me. It was the overwhelming sensation of being watched, something I had never felt so intensely before. When I reached the living room, I noticed another strange detail. The blinds on the window, which I was absolutely sure had been fully closed, were now slightly open, leaving a small gap, just enough for someone to peek inside. I froze for a moment, trying to process what could have happened. Frankie was now standing in the middle of the room, his fur bristling as he let out a low, guttural growl. He was staring at a dark corner near the kitchen, where the flashlight barely reached. I moved toward him slowly, my breathing quick and shallow. The kitchen seemed normal at first glance, but as I stepped in, I saw something that confirmed my worst fears. Someone had been there. A glass I'd left drying on the rack was now on the floor, unbroken but lying on its side. There was no reason for it to be there. My mind raced, trying to piece things together. It was no longer possible to brush this off as paranoia. Someone, or something, was definitely in the house. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were clear and deliberate, coming from upstairs. The sound froze me in place. Josh had a small attic he mostly used for storage, and it was rare for him to even go up there. I, on the other hand, had never set foot in it. There was no reason for anyone to be up there, which made the noise even more terrifying. I took a deep breath, holding the flashlight steady, and took a few cautious steps toward the stairs. I needed to be sure, but every step felt like a monumental effort. My mind was torn between the need to know what was happening and the overwhelming urge to flee. Before I could decide, something heavy fell upstairs, landing with a thud that made my heart stop for a moment. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was happening, it was real, and I had to get out of there. My body was in full alert mode, every muscle screaming at me to run, but fear rooted me to the spot. I decided I wouldn't go upstairs to check the attic. Whatever, or whoever, was up there, I didn't want to find out. Still clutching the flashlight, I slowly turned and began walking toward the front door. Each step felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they weren't coming from the attic, They were in the hallway, right behind me. I spun around so fast I almost dropped my phone. The flashlight's beams swept across the empty hallway, but the sound of the footsteps persisted. They were slow, deliberate, almost like someone was taunting me. Frankie bolted under the couch, his sudden movement startling me even more. That was it. I didn't need any more convincing. I grabbed the key from the table by the door and with shaking hands unlocked it. As I did, I felt a strange pressure on the back of my neck, like something unseen was standing just inches away. I didn't wait to confirm it. I threw the door open and ran outside. The street was quiet and empty, but the silence felt almost comforting compared to what I had just experienced. I sprinted to my car, got inside, and locked the doors. My heart was racing so fast I could barely catch my breath. I started the engine, and without thinking twice, drove to my friend Eric's house, who lived nearby. He greeted me at the door, confused by my panicked state, but once I explained what had happened, he realized how shaken I was. We stayed up the rest of the night, trying to figure out what could have been going on. The next morning, he came back with me to the house to grab some of my things. But what we found there only made things stranger. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. There was no sign of anyone or anything being there. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night. Maybe it was an intruder, but how do you explain the footsteps in the attic or the strange feeling of being watched? Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But what about the things out of place? I never stayed in that apartment alone again. Not long after, I moved out entirely. Still, the sound of those footsteps and the feeling of being watched haunt me. Whenever I think about it, I get the same cold shiver I felt that night. And honestly, I don't want to know what might have happened if I had stayed there any longer.